Basically, some of our long-term members of the Ottawa chapter in the audience there will remember that building because the Canadian Clock Museum was set up by me. It's officially a federal level registered charity and nonprofit that was created in December 1999. Museum opened to the public in that 1962 church, Calvary Pentecostal Church here in Deep River. And in fact, that's an earlier picture when the brown was good on the paint and the lawn was all green. And the first of 2 and maybe 3 meetings of the Ottawa chapter were held there in May of 2000, just after we opened. And Maynard, I think you're out in the audience there. You took pictures of all the attendees for at least the first 2 meetings. I think maybe you were standing here and we were back. No, I guess we were lined up here and you had the camera back here on your tripod. So if you still have pictures, you'll have evidence of those who attended. The museum, we've had over 15,000 physical visitors, which isn't a lot since we opened. It's averaging about 700 visitors a year. It's roughly a 2-hour drive from Ottawa up the Trans-Canada Highway. And if you get up to Deep River, we're just 30 seconds off the Trans-Canada Highway to come in to see this building. The original collection was one I based on my own, which was about 600 clocks to focus Canadian. We've grown up to over 3,500, maybe 3,700 different clocks as well, plus a reference library. It's got over 600 books and many hundreds of Clocks magazine and the complete set of the hard copy NAWCC bulletin. And as anybody who's a member of the bulletin knows today, you can go online on the website and they've all been scanned in. You can do a word search for just about everything you want to know. Museum's main website, as of a year and a half ago, we've added a virtual tour. A couple of young guys set it up here, and from them we know that since a year ago last fall, over 50,000 people have clicked on that link. No way to know how long they were doing the picture, doing the tour, but this is what you get when you click on it, and you may have already done so. And it opens basically looking into the museum's exhibit area, which is up in the upper landing, but you can use your mouse, rotate around, and down here is the front door with the steps as well. We don't have wheelchair access easily, so sometimes we can help people carry up a wheelchair, but the front door here, and there are clocks everywhere over the front door. And I'm not sure how many of these were here when we started, but we certainly added quite a few. I will try to keep the talk down to something around 30-35 minutes with the presentation, otherwise it will take forever. I did a Zoom presentation of a tour last Wednesday evening for the Oakville Historical Society, and with all the questions and answers and whatever, it ran 1.5 hours. So there's a lot to talk about. I won't bore you for that long. So Starburst, Sunburst, 1960s and 70s. You can actually zoom in. Those 9 were made by West Clocks in Peterborough. Left and right, you've got Harry Snyder, wall clocks, and they're different locations. You can actually go down the stairs and choose the location down below here where you have a more direct look at those, but it would take forever. We've got, Snyder had all kinds of starburst, sunburst clocks, especially in the 60s and 70s. I went online actually and discovered on the internet and through a telephone directory, Michael Snyder, who was Harry Snyder's son. Michael joined the company in 62, carried on when his father got ill and passed away, and Michael ran the business till about 1976. When I contacted him 20 years ago, he was overjoyed anybody cared, and he provided a binder with several pages of the history and color photocopies of all the catalogs that he had from the 60s and the 70s, including his own from the 70s. So all kinds of Snyder clocks, pink and turquoise. We got people looking in yesterday, for instance. Many older visitors remember the turquoise and the pink. which were refrigerators and stoves back in kitchens way back then. Well, love them or hate them. We got some ugly examples. Actually, I will pop down here. And if you look around here, you've got, if I back out a bit, again, just using the mouse, you've got basket style, as he was called. You had actually all kinds of different models, and many of these we've managed to track down: the white, the brown, the black, the pink, and the turquoise for those. A lot of crazy different designs. If we go back up to the entrance, and you will note the yellow tape on the floor everywhere, of course. When COVID-19 struck, I think we were able to open sometime in the summer. That was all museums in Ontario were locked down a total of 4 times. The big ones took forever to reopen. I was able to open immediately the next day, sort of thing, for obvious reasons. And yellow tape on the floor, and we've left that still there today with the arrows pointing a direction. Rarely were there enough people in the allowed days to have to worry about the arrows, but a bit of humor, because before the pandemic, I would often mention visitors when they come in, if you had several adults or kids and whatever, I would literally say there's no yellow brick road. And for those who remember, that was the Wizard of Oz. So ever since the pandemic, there's been a yellow brick road in here. Again, those white circles on the floor, you can actually click on those and move around. To keep the time reasonable, I'm going to focus mainly on Canadian-made clocks. Visitors often leave saying they find it surprising how many companies in Canada actually made clocks. So down here, you've got this set here, part of our collection of Girotti, Girotti. That's a Italian name, 2 of the 6 Girotti brothers, St. Catharines, Ontario, early 60s to the late 70s. They were doing a lot of things with molded chalkware materials, including picture frames and pedestals and statues. But they also had sections like this that were molded and then bolted on wooden panels. So they're typically battery wall clocks, both horizontal and vertical wooden frames. Interesting over here, presumably, there's no way to know because I don't think any of the Girotti brothers are around to ask anymore, but that's not starburst or sunburst, which is typical 60s and 70s. Same time period, what I'm calling a fan-shaped one. We've got 2 different frame styles, and there might be a third one. Very thick central wooden dial and very thick wooden rays. And the dials basically, don't know how close I can get in on this, but the dials, when you'll see the script name Girotti on the dial, but the hour markers are literally square section brass rod pieces cut. The quarter hour markers are larger in thickness compared to the smaller ones. In the 70s, the same as Michael Snyder did for Toronto, they started making wall models, battery again, but with molded polymer materials to create the cases, and then they could spray paint them different colors. I got lucky in doing research. I managed to borrow and photocopy a 1971 Girotti catalog, so we know the clock models that were in that catalog, and we managed to find most of them. Fortunately, I continued to look online. The problem is, as you know, if you buy online, things you're looking for from the mid-20th century, that's mid-century modern or retro, asking prices have gone up factor 3 and 4 and 5 and more over the last 10 to 15 years. So even things like this are rather expensive to find. And what I want to do is set up over here very briefly. We have our own reference library. So we have that complete set of bulletins over here. I've actually got a copy stand set up. There's not much space to use it downstairs. So copy stand, Clocks Magazine, Antiquarian Horology, and over 600 books on all aspects of clocks and watches and time period. If you want information about Art Deco or Art Nouveau, that sort of thing, we've got children's time teaching books. We've got children's time teaching clocks and simple mechanical ones where physically you look at shapes and numbers and whatever. But we've also got electronic ones. If I can check some of these electronic ones that actually have a synthesized voice. Kelly, the time teaching clock, is actually works both French and English. And that one, we get kids can touch again during the pandemic, of course, everybody with masks, including the children, and not touching. We have in this particular area some examples of, I'm going to back to here. We have some of the examples of the Pagano wall clocks. We have a separate Pagano room I'll show you afterwards, but these are some of the examples. We have at least one good example of every known catalog Pagano clock. That's wall, mantle, and shelf, and also the hall clocks. We don't yet have one of the premier model, which, as you might know, was in the first catalog, 1904, black finish on a cast iron case. Those are valued at $5,000 and up, and so far we don't have one. This, for those of you who know that type of thing, that's a jeweler's regulator. I picked that up in Ottawa from a donor couple 1 week before the pandemic hit. They'd had it 30 years. They'd bought it at an estate sale somewhere in the Toronto area and had run it for 30 years. It's a Waterbury Clock Company model 70 from the 1910 catalog. It's as heavy as it looks. And in fact, Jordan Renault and I together put that up. He cleaned the movement and I touched up the case a little bit. So it's this sort of, again, giving examples of things. In theory, that came out of a post office in Powassan, south of North Bay. I tried once, so far I haven't been able to confirm that, but I suppose post office would look for a better quality clock as well as jewelry shops. As an example, this one here, it's the sort of grandfather clocks that seniors going into retirement homes can't give away. The majority of these are listed online, Kijiji and elsewhere, for just $500, $300, $200. That particular one is Henschel Clock Company out of Waterloo. It was donated to the museum 2 years ago by a lady here in town. It does run. I keep the weights going, the system running, the pendulum. And it was her brother. She didn't enjoy having it. So, but that's the sort of thing that you can't give away. People don't want it. So somehow I think if I can sneak over in here, it's amazing how the technology works. As far as Canadian made clocks, this is our collection of Canada and Hamilton Clock Company clocks. For those of you who know, there's an out of print book written by Jane Vicaris and Jim Connell when they were alive. It basically did a lot of research, and they were convinced that the clock movements and the clock cases were all made starting in Whitby, 4 years in Whitby. With these two, the most commonly one found are the 30-hour OG clocks. Based on their research, 100% made in Canada, the movements and the cases. 1876, people from Hamilton bought the equipment, apparently, moved it to a factory in Hamilton, set up the Hamilton Clock Company, and that you had in business for 4 years up to 1880. They were doing OG clocks again, and they started making small shelf style clocks that are typically what the Americans were doing as well. The example up here, that's one of many things we get donated. That was donated probably 15 years ago, man north of Toronto, and that's a Hamilton Clock Company spring-driven movement. The OGs, of course, are 30-hour weight-driven. The big production period, of course, was the Hamilton Clock Company, Hamilton. So from Canada Clock Company, Hamilton, a correction there, 1880 to 1884. Examples are known of the schoolhouse style of clock from that same time period. This one over here, this wall clock is a very unusual design, and that's the Hamilton Clock Company, Hamilton, somewhere between 1880 and 1884. They made all sorts of higher end 8-day mirror-sided clocks. That's the city of Hamilton model with the hand-painted glass tablet, the cherubs, of course. Turns out there were 3 different models of mirror side that were made by Canada Clock Company Hamilton. There were also some 30-hour clocks and sometimes just timepieces that would be time only. So some of these are just 30 hours, time and strike on a spring, sometimes just time only, or time and an alarm as a sort of a calendar clock. So the same as American companies were doing, you had these cottage clocks, as they were called. These are 3 examples here with different model names. You had the design of the glass tablets. Now, if I zoom in here, you may or may not know that you find the glass tablets that look like these. Those were acid etched designs. Very few, if any, American companies made acid etched design glass tablets, but you will find those on the Hamilton Clock Company Hamilton and the Canada Clock Company Hamilton clocks. When the book was published, all the research, and no catalogs have turned up since then either, the model names that are known were on the labels of clocks that did have the model names on them. So that's how best we know about model names. The styles are basically very similar, copies one way or another, who copied whom, of American clocks from the same time. For instance, if we look down here, there's another mirror side down here, and that's the Victoria model. And Sony made one called Triumph, and I think the New Haven Clock Company made one that looks darn near the same, so you have to be careful if you're bidding on one listed online. Now, what I wanted to do is come back, whoops, come here, and swing around. That melodeon, by the way, people can sit and play at. Again, you have to pump the pedal. But this is what I'm zooming in here. If you read my column in the Bytown Times this month, that's the W.A. Wood Globe Time Recorder's clock. We're estimating about 1910. As I mentioned to some of you earlier, at the metal plaque on the bottom, it says it was patented in August 1907. I managed to track that down. Montreal street directories, you can get those, copy screen saved sections out of them and all the rest of it. The bad news is, from their point of view, this company was listed in the Montreal Directory only from about 1908 to 1916. So you've got about 8 years of competition. It turns out the style looks very, very similar to what, for instance, the Day Register Company out of Syracuse, New York was doing. Looks identical on the outside, but he managed to get a patent in 1907, Canadian patent. There's no reference that I could see inside the patent when I downloaded it, any reference to earlier patents. 53 claims, very detailed claims, and all the improvements he was making that made this work so beautifully for the operation for a factory that owned something like this for their employees to keep track. Rather than a card system, there's a drum that's inside that rotates this way, and it's tied into this handle on the outside. If you've ever seen one of these before, IBM seemed to do the same thing later. This particular one has space for 100 employee numbers. So you would actually swing this arm around to your employee number over here, push it in, and that would record on the big drum with space for 100 employee numbers listed. It would record the time on that. So it's interesting to be able to see that sort of thing. Again, Canadian, and I plan to submit that to a bulletin in Pennsylvania for peer review sometime in the next few weeks. We do have weight-driven clocks of all kinds. These are peddler type clocks. Some of those you'll be familiar with. We do have some, and again, I can answer questions later if they like. We've got 3 examples, Upper and Lower Canada. If you know the style, the half column and the splat at the top, wooden movement, hand-painted wooden dial. And Upper Canada, Lower Canada. This one down here is Niagara Falls, Upper Canada as well. Across the middle, then we've got various examples of weight-driven brass movement clocks, both 30-hour and 8-day. If you know this style of clock, there were peddlers in Leeds County importing them in. Lots of information in Early Canadian Timekeepers, another book that's fabulous but out of print. So this has a Van Tassel, which is in Leeds County, CW, Canada West. For the visitors coming in, we've left the dial down so you can see the brass movement. When I'm talking wood movements, we've got an 1820s or 30s, so basically a 200-year-old wooden movement here that people can see live. So Leeds County, also Toronto and Hamilton, Canada West labels as well on some of these weight-driven clocks. So that's the sort of thing you had back then. So just for fun, so I can back around here, we do have 2 fabulous wall maps. This one shows Leeds and Grenville County, Canada West, the western part of the province of Canada at that point, 1861, printed in Kingston, Canada West. So it shows Leeds and Grenville County. Visitors are welcome to come in and have a closer look. You've got thousands of handwritten names out in the rural areas here, people living on farms. That's 1861, before you had any electricity or anything else. So quick look at another map. When I talked about those Leeds County labels, Canada West, this is an original wall map printed in 1853 of the province of Canada, east and west. And if you look closely at it, nearby Pembroke is on the map, but for Ottawa, you still have Bytown. So people interested in maps will come in and have a closer look to see whether where they grew up, it was still listed way back in 1861, and sometimes it was. What I can do on the lower left corner, if you wish, there is a floor plan, which allows you to look down from the ceiling. Don't ask me how they did this, but it's 360-degree high definition pictures, not video. So I've just taken us into the Peganaw room, where we've got a significant collection of Peganaw clocks of all kinds. There's the large beaver, for example. We have artifacts that aren't clocks, but from the same time period. So basically, we've got a 1914 crank telephone, Canadian made, of course. And that gets older visitors thinking about party lines and ringtones and all the rest of it, the memories of that sort of thing. For record players, this is a Columbia phonograph company out of the States. Outside horn still there, dates to about 1910, plays 78 records, hard plastic records with a steel needle. We've got down here a floor model of a Northern Electric radio, 1930s, glass tubes, of course, and younger people who've never seen glass tubes, we've got some examples on the top. We don't have a tube tester. People remember sometimes tube testers. I've actually got a picture I took in the multi-dealer shop south of Barrie a few years ago. So you could take your tubes if the sound got fuzzy or the picture got fuzzy on your television, take the tubes down and test them, see how they're working out. So as those of you who know Peganaw clocks, he didn't call them grandfather clocks. The labels will say Hall clock, H-A-L-L. And these were the most expensive clocks compared to their mantle clocks or wall clocks, of course. Halifax model here, that's oak. This is the Nelson model, mahogany, and mahogany was always an extra cost upgrade. The 7 models, and these are 3 that were in the first couple of catalogs, had the brass hands and numbers. That's the leader model with molded pebbled glass sections down here. These were all 8-day weight-driven pendulum clocks. What we have down here is the one that the spring broke in, and I've actually got a replacement so we can play Thomas Edison cylinders with a big multicolored horn as well. So we can play Edison music cylinders, both in the original horn type. And also we've got floor models. By 1915, outside horns were put inside. So that's a floor model, plays Edison cylinders. We've got a floor model that plays Edison flat records. And for those who are not familiar with those, they're much thicker than 78s. They are up and down groove, not sideways, so you can't play them on a 78s player. Part of our collection of Pagano mantle clocks, shelf clocks. Box style was the same as what the Americans are doing in the early 1900s. You get into the 1920s and 30s, the tambour style was popular. If I switch over to this location. And again, you can do this at home using your mouse and clicking around wherever. So tambour style with 1920s and 30s, the humpback style, the bigger something. This is a Chester model, not in the last known catalog from 1926, 28 that was. So 1930s, humpbacks were starting to come in. That's the only one that Pagano did. In business making clocks and cases, in fact, it made all the clock movements until about 1941. As those of you know the history of Pagano, clock, the factories that made furniture, in fact, in Berlin, Ontario, which became Kitchener in 1916. Berlin or Kitchener, for most of that production time, the wooden cases were made in the furniture factories. Least expensive back then, and maybe somewhat today, were the Maple Leaf kitchen clocks around 1910, 1915. There were a lot of mission style shelf clocks as well with the brass numbers. There's the Montreal model. You could, the furniture, if you go back 120 years, the furniture for most wood, for most people was oak, golden finish or darker. You could pay extra for mahogany. That's the Stratford model with mahogany, and walnut was also an option for some clocks as well. You might come across a black Pagano mantle clock. If you do, take care, it's $1,000 and up. The odds are, though, if you see a black one looking like that, it is one of the million or more black mantle clocks made in the States in the early 1900s. So just in the first catalog, there were some, including the Ontario that you get with the black finish. Those are quite rare. Canadian time, a couple of wall models. That's a very common one today, for instance. And that particular example, time and calendar, was donated 3 years ago by a family in Saskatchewan. So we do get donations, and if we accept them, we issue tax receipts, and we put a note on the wall to put them up to acknowledge the donation. This was a fellow, he was part of the school system in Saskatchewan back in the 1960s, and pendulum clocks were being taken out of service in schools, railway stations, elsewhere, thrown on the dumpster or sold off at very low cost. The lady in Ontario, her family from Saskatchewan, her dad got this for $2 back in 1962. Tax receipt. It's got a Manitoba company, Christie, that actually sold clocks and blackboards and chalk and everything else across the school system in Western Canada. And I think we issued a tax receipt for about $1,000. So as I'm getting close to my time here for the moment, where do I want to go? Crazy modern things. So let's go back over here. Advertising clocks, Canadian made, Toronto basically, or the Labatt's one up here is Shunfield and Hamilton as early as 1935. These are all made in the Toronto area, various companies, listings in business directories. And an easy clock for kids to read. Half the 10-year-olds who come in can't read the old-fashioned analog dials, but that's the easiest, but at least you got Arabic numbers in 12 locations. Some of the clocks only have numbers on the quarter. Some of them only have dots or markers somehow for the time. And then you get up here to this sort of thing, and that's the real challenge even for some adults these days. Wolf Brothers in Toronto made those for Carling's Black Label beer back then. I want to go back to here. There was a major company that made clocks in Montreal. The crazy name was the Canadian Neon Ray Clock Company. They did make neon clocks, larger ones like this one, smaller ones. They made round and square backlit advertising clocks, both French and English. And if you know the name Baird, Edward Baird, these two, the one on the left, the one on the right, these are extremely rare. Baird had a factory in Montreal for only 3 years, around 1887 to 1889, before he moved his factory to Plattsburgh, New York. Seth Thomas movement brought in from Connecticut, spring-driven, time only. The doors basically on the Montreal models were paper mache molded, so that if you come in, a man named Fortier, for example, and wanted 5 clocks to promote his cigars in shops, you could actually, they made the mold for one and then mold as many as they wanted. So these are quite rare today. Some of you might well know that the value of these is over $2,000 if you can find them. The fellow who's the expert lives in New York City, still alive. He had a huge collection at one point. We have his book in our reference library about those. For the ladies especially, but men as well, these are the known 6 models of Blue Mountain Pottery supplied cases for Bulova Caravel model battery wall clocks. You're talking late 60s into the 70s. There were various Blue Mountain Pottery colors, of course. And so Blue Mountain Pottery didn't make clocks and sell clocks. They made the cases for Bulova. These are battery operated. Ugly fish, ugly chicken, $150 and up asking price if you can find them online today. And finally, I want to get over into here. There's another item, of course, that is not a clock. That's a made in Toronto, Philips black and white television set from the late 50s. And yes, we've got rabbit ears up. We've got the motor drive. If you had the motor on the antennas, you'd have to send somebody out and rotate the antenna, back in the 50s especially. We can actually play vinyl records and 78s on this one. That's an Electro-Home Apollo model, late 60s into the 70s. Record player with the dome top on it. Kitchen clocks, all kinds of kitchen clocks. We've got West clocks. We've also got General Electric. For instance, they made electric kitchen clocks, electric table clocks, alarm clocks. Ingram out of the States, one of the big 8. Ingram Canadian in Toronto, 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So we have examples, not as many as for General Electric, but we've got examples of some of their electric wall clocks, kitchen clocks. Everybody had a kitchen clock back in the 40s and 50s. This example is actually a wind-up spring-driven, but most of them had this ugly cable that you hung the clock up on the wall, and the cable went down to the baseboard where the plug-in was. This Daisy model, for instance, it's been up a few years now, and I've run out of fingers to count the number of times people come in and remember their parents or grandparents had that model. Animated alarm clocks for children. We have 3 from West Clocks. We've got those 2 from Ingram Canadian. We've got the Westerner on the left, sorry. And on the right, the Mountie. The system is rather worn inside, so it won't run for a full day, but these were spring-driven wind-up alarm clocks, made for children, that sort of thing, also produced in the States and Britain and France. But those are the Canadian, these are the 2 Canadian models here, and the 3 from West Clocks as well. I'll finish up basically with humpback clocks. These sorts of things were more like sort of when the tambours are phased out, you're more into that sort of thing. So basically into the 40s, up into the mid 1950s. Typically, if you find two winding holes, it's time and strike on the hour. Some of them are available. For instance, this one down here, some models available with 3 winding holes. You had chimes, typically Westminster, but the best of them had a choice of several different chime tunes. These are examples from Black Forest Clock Company, Toronto. Jane Varkaris did a lot of research when she was alive. 1928 to 1941 in Toronto, up until the war, importing clocks, all sorts of things from Germany. Changed their name to Forestville in 1941 because of the war. Carried on until the late 70s, back to importing German clocks. During the war, you'll find examples with Canadian-made wood cases, and the movements brought in from the States or even from England, if they could get them. So finally, we can finish up with these beautiful things, or not. Anybody remember these from the 50s? You had boats with a clock. There's one there, another one down here. You had horses with a clock in the horseshoe, metal. You had ceramic, Black Panthers with pink or black or brown or whatever. You had these little wind-up table clocks, boudoir clocks with or without an alarm built in. These are all Snyder, basically 1950s Harry Snyder. And we've got a few up here. There's one of Michael Snyder's wooden cased ones that were designed and made in Toronto back more in the 1960s. Then for some reason in the 60s, brass bar markers were common as well. So these two are examples up in here of two that were made by the Snyder Company later in the 60s. Snyder, I keep saying Snyder, there are no paper labels basically on most of these, but you will see the name on the dial, Snyder, spelled with script, S-N-I-D-E-R. He had what he called the Golden Goddess, this one down here. Looks like 1920s, 30s nude, but that was actually a wind-up or an electric motor version that he called the Golden Goddess. Finally, in case you find some from the same time period, you might find a horse with a clock in the horseshoe, various versions as well. Breslin, B-R-E-S-L-I-N, Breslin Industries, Toronto. They were more lamps and lampshades in the 60s, but I often suggest that these horse clocks in the 50s probably were tied into the black and white television programs with Roy Rogers and Hopalong Cassidy and all the rest of it. So that's just a suggestion. This gorgeous piece down here, if you've been to the museum, you might have seen this one or some other ones. That crazy thing is actually an electric lamp, an electric clock. It looks like a telephone. We've got various color versions. We'll never get the shade for the fire engine red telephone, but it's not a working telephone. It's actually, if you push the button at this end when it's plugged in, down here at the mouthpiece, behind the mica layer, it glows bright orange and hot, so you can light your cigarette. So believe it or not, most visitors wouldn't know that. Occasionally somebody in who was aware, an uncle or somebody had one, but it's a lamp, a clock, and a cigarette lighter. Crazy thing. TV lamps were the in thing in the 1950s. You bought an early black and white set, and you were convinced the salesman convinced you to buy a lamp as well. So it was a low wattage lamp with ceramic animals or other designs, a light bulb behind. People collect TV lamps. There are websites on the internet about collecting TV lamps. Harry put a clock in his. So you've got electric clock with a light bulb behind. There's 2 Black Panthers. There's a brown version of the horse. He also had sheet metal designs, and this will be the last as time marches on. That's the model 505, 504. To me, that looks like an in-car heater. And on the top of the television set, we have this gorgeous one. That's his model 503. He registered those designs in Canada in 1957. In case you didn't know, you can go online now and find Canadian design patents. I was able to download photocopies of the design sheets that were signed by Harry Snyder back in 1957. So I'll close on a scary note as far as costs. That model, we don't have all colors yet for the other two, but we actually have the turquoise, we've got the pink, the white, the brown, and the black. And if you'd asked me 10, 12 years ago, what's the value? I might have said $100, $125. I don't want anybody to faint when I tell you, but there are two black ones listed for sale online at the moment in Canada, both of them over $1,000. One something like $1,100, the other's $1,400. So from that point of view, that's a bit crazy. But if I stop the share at that point, we'll take it back to whoever's at the other end, Laurie or whatever.
Thank you, Allan. My mind's blown. Label.
Yeah. And of course, anybody can go online. I say over 50,000 hits apparently in 15 months. You can go on, use your own mouse and zoom in, and it's high definition, so you'd probably be able to read some of the labels at least and get a better feeling. Nothing's moving, nobody's talking, but and you won't hear the record players. You've got to come to hear an Edison cylinder live.
I don't have any questions in the chat yet here on the Zoom, but myself, can you tell me a little bit about how the museum got started and what the future may hold?
Yeah, the museum, I started collecting clocks in the 1980s. I was working as a research scientist in chemistry at nearby Chalk River A's Atomic Energy Canada labs. And some people remind me back in the maybe 1990s, I was talking about opening a museum. What kind of a crazy change of career is that? So basically, I looked into the options, paid a significant amount of money for lawyers in Ottawa, because your local house insurance lawyer doesn't do anything like that. And actually, it was set up as a nonprofit, the Canadian Clock Museum in Canada. Was, I think, registered almost Christmas Day back in 1999. Meanwhile, I'd retired from my science job in September, and the next next Monday, I actually went to a tourism conference in nearby Pembroke, so didn't stop. From that point of view, started with about 600. The building became available. The local Calvary Pentecostal Church people decided they wanted to sell, and we took possession March 1st of 2000. And for better for worse, I designed the layout of the building inside. We hired a young fellow and his father out of nearby Chalk River to do all of the physical construction work. So plywood panels, a lot of burlap, big section of burlap brought in from Ottawa, and they put it up all on the walls. And then for better for worse, I and some colleagues and volunteers started to put things up and decide where to put shelves. So a lot of hardware shelves on the wall. But with the plywood, it's easy to put screws in and that sort of thing and have some good support. So that was that point of view. From March 1st to early May, started to make changes in construction inside, replaced the whole front steps inside. They were a torture to seniors when it was a church. And so replaced the stairs, new carpeting down everywhere, and construction of the mini rooms everywhere else that you'll see when you do your tour and pull up the floor plan. And so starting early May, the Ottawa chapter met here for the first time back then, as I mentioned at the beginning. And we've had visitors in every day. I keep, not every day, but every week and every month. I do keep basically a monthly sheet beside the cash register. We haven't changed the admission fee. It's still $5 each for adults, or $10 for a family, or $2 for a student. So from that point of view, I keep a daily record on a monthly sheet, and I've now got all those for all the years to start in the computer. So I've got a running total of the number of visitors, and it averages about 700 a year, which is not big for a big museum in Ottawa, but it's not bad for a small one here. And in a sense, the rest is history, because the museum's website, there isn't a month, well, a week goes by that I don't get requests by email from people who find or inherit clocks. I'll get telephone calls. A bit of humor, the Hamilton Clock Company. Some of you know there was a Hamilton Clock Company in Connecticut. And every once in a while, once or twice a year, I'll get a telephone call from the States with an American accent, somebody asking about their retirement Hamilton Clock Company clock, which was sort of 1970s, not 1870s. And I quickly have to point people out that, sorry, it's the wrong Hamilton Clock Company. But again, you know, requests, I got several days ago, I got a request from a fellow in somewhere in Canada, but he had a Pagana model wall clock, Canadian time wall clock, that had come from his grandparents in Alberta. And he said, there's a winding hole on the front. Which way do I turn the key? And so I went and double checked our example and then emailed him back, said it's counterclockwise. And by the way, it might need some cleaning if it hasn't had any work done on it since it left the factory. And it was a Berlin period one. He replied back and said that various family members had it restored, you know, over the years, and he wound the clock up and it's running fine. And thanks for the information. So it's the way that the museum, we continue to help people who find or inherit clocks, especially Canadian.
Wonderful. In the chat here, Thomas says, phenomenal virtual access to the museum. It is similar to Google Earth in its operation.
And I'm getting a little better with using the mouse as well, because if I click the mouse along the wrong way, the stupid thing jumps in or out. So it's a function on the mouse that I don't want to use. I'm just using the roller to zoom in and out. And if I hit one of the side buttons, then it does a bit crazy stuff, but I'm getting better at that.
No, it's really amazing. I could have you go on for hours.
Well, it could happen.
And from anybody else at the meeting site?
Yeah, Paul at the meeting or Don at the meeting, any questions? They've all gone home.
Oh, there's Paul. No, there's Don.
There you go. Any questions?
Could you just ask Allan the plans for the future?
Are there any plans for the immediate future? I'll have to turn this off here.
The question is, Allan, do you have plans for the future for the museum?
This is the microphone.
Getting a bit of feedback there. So the questions from was any plans for the immediate future?
Yes. We are a nonprofit. We've got a very small board, including my brother and a good friend from university days way back, and Jordan Renault, our conservator. Some of you know that health is not good at the moment, but he's been on the museum's conservator right from way back in the spring of 2000. Of customers, as some of you know, almost a self-trained. He's an expert on British tall case clocks. I consulted him when I get questions from people asking about their British tall case clocks. The books in our reference library that list thousands of, if you like, of old British clock makers and watchmakers as well. So we have that in the reference library that I can use, but Jordan can look at a clock and at the case design, the movement design, and know within a decade probably the age of the clock. So his ability to do that. And in the longer term, again, we're nonprofit, so I do get visitors asking some.
Oh, you're losing your sound there, Allan.
Can you hear it still?
Yeah, now I can. It's dropping in and out.
Sure where the speaker, oh, it's on the computer, of course, facing the camera, and of course, the speaker is obviously at the front of the in the front of the computer itself. Fair enough. Good. Anyhow, as far as spoken of, in my will, my ashes are supposed to be on a shelf in here, but that doesn't help if there's nobody running it. The council is supportive over the years for the museum motion in their brochures and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, but we've been paying municipal tax at the residential label rate right from the start. So we've paid a fair chunk of money. My plan is, while I'm still healthy and able to do that, and I should put that on my to-do list, is sit down with town council and say, are you willing to over the museum's operate? Because basically, so the municipal taxes plus heat, electricity, internet connections, that sort of thing. So from that point of view, probably $20,000, but then you've got to have somebody to run this. You're going to have to hire maybe for $50 a junior or graduate from a school of horology, museum. There are museum college and university courses being given in Ottawa and Toronto. So you may have somebody you can tempt back to come up here and work with this museum. It's so because I keep buying stuff. So downstairs is full, the exhibition area is full. I can't resist finding new things for the collection that are filling in some basic gaps. We've had to turn. Somebody had a 200-year-old tall case clock, British, in Southern Ontario, and he got no space. And then people like that are desperate to find homes for things. One that I bounced off the Ottawa lady contacted 2 weeks ago by email. She'd been here with her husband 10, 12 years ago, and he since passed away. He has had a library of something like 250 books, 50 smaller pamphlets and that sort of thing. She's looking for, her husband spent all kinds of time putting that together. She can't find any, use the books, and checked with the Toronto Public Library, other associations like our chapter once had a library, but it was tough to be able to operate the thing. Clemens was coordinated that for a proper place to store them, access by the chapter. It's fabulous to be able to borrow books for a couple of weeks or all sorts of things, but the practicality practically zero in space. If we ain't got, you need somebody with be able to do that likely.
Yeah.
Allan to use in Toronto.
Yeah, it's difficult with the to find people to be able to do that sort of thing and to carry on the legacies.
Yeah, well, and mentioned.
Your sound is definitely cutting out a lot more now.
And Paul did mention during the early business volunteers to do key things for the chapter can be difficult. Setting up a live.
That's true. Very true. The Thomas also says, how are you financed and do you get donations resulting from the virtual views?
No surprise, perhaps, in 23 years. They cover about 20 operating expense. We get a donations jar, which covers about another 10%. Started getting donations. We're online. Well, we're actually part of now, which is a nonprofit Canadian company. Money that goes in for all kinds of nonprofits across Canada. So we're starting to get a few $100s a year from them. And occasionally, if I help somebody online by telephone, they'll actually mail a check to the museum, basically maybe $100 to say. Yes, about 75, 80 contribution checks for which I get. So, yeah. More than just running it, funding it as well is critical. But
Yeah.
you know, it's a way to give back to this great country.
Yeah. Oh, it's really too bad we're having more sound problems with your speaking there. That's really unfortunate. We're cutting up. Well, could you repeat the name of the company that you were getting some funding from?
It's Canada.
Okay, got the Canada.
Canada.
No, we've lost you entirely, Alan. Yeah, we got your video, but your sound is really, it's progressively getting worse, I think.
Okay.
I'm sorry. You should give me a call on my cell phone, then I can relay.
And we don't have any more questions. We're having audio difficulties, so we'll move on.
Thank you, Alan, very much. It was that's wonderful. We'll have to do something more again sometime with an even longer one. Definitely double thumbs up. Thank you. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Pinecrest.
Thank you. We will now I'll turn over the floor to Danielle and to Don Purchase, and who will run the auction. And at the end of the auction, that will conclude our meeting. If there are any other points of business we should deal with, please let me know.
All right, so thank you. I don't know how it's going to work with the. I don't know if we can.